The station smelled like old metal and burnt coffee. That was the first thing anyone noticed when they arrived at Waypoint Kasara. The second thing was that it looked like it was held together by luck and a few bolts that had no business still working. Pipes ran along the ceiling in places they probably should not have been. One of the wall panels near the docking bay had a dent in it the size of a person. A small handwritten sign next to it said, "Do not lean here." Nobody knew who wrote it. It had always been there. Do-hun stood at the observation window and looked out at the stars. He had a cup of coffee in one hand and a datapad in the other. The datapad had a list of biosamples he was supposed to be cataloging. He had not looked at it in 20 minutes. The stars were more interesting. They always were. Waypoint Kasara sat at the far edge of what the interstellar conclave called its diplomatic zone. In practice, this meant it was the kind of place that nobody important ever came to on purpose. Ships stopped here when they needed fuel or repairs and had no better option. The conclave had assigned the station to humanity about 6 years ago, and most of the other species assumed it was an insult. Maybe it was. Do-hun had never really thought about it that way. It was a station. It had windows. The view was good. He heard footsteps behind him and did not turn around. He already knew who it was by the sound. Ariam walked the same way she did everything else. Fast, direct, like she had somewhere to be, and the universe owed her a clear path. She stopped beside him and looked out the window for exactly 3 seconds before turning back to her work. "The pressure coupling in Docking Bay 2 is going to fail by morning," she said. "How long to fix it?" Do-hun asked. "Already fixed it, but the part I used came from the recycling unit on level 3, so now that might fail by afternoon. And when that fails, I'll fix it with something else." She said this the same way someone else might say the sky was blue. A simple fact. Do-hun nodded and went back to looking at the stars. Ariam was the best engineer Do-hun had ever met, and he had met several. She had a way of looking at broken things and seeing not what they were, but what they could become with a little rearranging. The station should not have been functioning at its current level. By any reasonable measure, at least 4 of its core systems were past the point where they should have been replaced. Instead, they worked. Not perfectly, but they worked, and on Kasara, that was enough. Commander Boram was in the small room he called his office, though it was really just a table and 2 chairs pushed into a corner of the crew area. He was reading something on his screen and frowning at it. He frowned at most things. It was not an angry frown. It was more the frown of a man who had seen a great deal of the galaxy and had decided it generally needed more attention than it was getting. "We have a message," he said when Do-hun walked in. He turned the screen around. Do-hun read it twice. Then he sat down and read it a 3rd time. The message was from the Conclave Transit Authority. It said that a diplomatic convoy carrying representatives from 5 member species was being rerouted due to engine trouble with the lead vessel. The convoy would need to make an emergency stop. Kasara was the closest available station. They would arrive in 2 days. 5 delegations, Do-hun said. 5. Boram agreed. Vithori, Drelkai, Maravine, Soon, and the Chavari. That is what it says. Do-hun set the datapad down on the table. "They are going to hate it here." "Probably," Boram said. He did not seem upset about this. He picked up his coffee mug, found it empty, and set it back down again. "Go tell the others." Hyunwoo was in the small lab on level 2 when Do-hun found him. He was a young man, the youngest on the crew, with an energy that had not yet been worn down by the reality of life on a station that smelled like old metal. When Do-hun told him about the convoy, his eyes went wide. 5 delegations, he said, here at Kasara. That is what the message said. Hyunwoo immediately started talking about welcome procedures and presentation materials and whether the crew had enough clean uniforms. Do-hun let him talk for a while before mentioning, gently, that the Drelkai considered direct eye contact an act of aggression. Hyunwoo stopped mid-sentence. He looked genuinely troubled by this information. Somi was the last one Do-hun told. She was in her own workspace, surrounded by screens full of text in languages that most people had never seen. She was the station's linguist and cultural analyst, and she took both roles seriously. When Do-hun gave her the news, she was quiet for a moment. "The Drelkai delegation," she said. "Do we know which ambassador?" "No details yet." She turned back to her screens. "I will prepare." That evening, the four of them sat together in the crew room and ate a meal that Hyunwoo had cooked. It was a simple thing: rice and some vegetables and a sauce that used spices from a jar that had been on the station since before any of them arrived. It was good. The station hummed around them, its old systems doing their work. Borum looked around the table. "The convoy expects a conclave way station," he said. "Clean, formal, standard. They are not going to find that here." He paused. "What they are going to find is us. So let us make sure that is enough." Nobody argued with this. There was nothing to argue. It was simply the truth of where they were and who they were. And on Kasara, that had always been enough to get through the day. After the meal, Ariam went back to work on the recycling unit. Hyunwoo started making lists. Somi read through old diplomatic files until late into the night. Do-hoon washed the dishes and then stood at the observation window again, looking at the stars, drinking the last of his coffee. The convoy was 2 days out. The station was old and patched and full of small problems, and the five of them had exactly 48 hours to get ready for guests who had already decided before arriving that there was nothing here worth seeing. Do-hoon finished his coffee. He put the cup in the sink. Then he picked up his datapad and finally started cataloging the biosamples. There was work to do, and the stars would still be there tomorrow. The convoy docked on a Tuesday morning, Kasara time, which meant nothing to any of the visiting delegations but mattered a great deal to Hyunwoo, who had written it down in his notes at the top of the page and underlined it twice. He was standing at the docking bay entrance in a clean uniform, holding a small welcome card he had made himself. Ariam stood next to him in a slightly less clean uniform, her arms crossed, watching the airlock with the expression of someone who had just finished a very long repair job and was not entirely sure the thing she fixed was going to hold. It held. The airlock opened smoothly, which was a small miracle, and the first delegates stepped through. The Vithori came first. They were tall and moved carefully, like they were always thinking about how much space they were taking up. Their lead delegate, a figure called Overseer Rune, looked at the docking bay wall with the slow, measuring gaze of someone calculating how long it would take for everything around him to fall apart. He turned this gaze on Hyunwoo next. Hyunwoo smiled and held out the welcome card. Rune looked at the card. He looked at Hyunwoo. He took the card very slowly, the way you might accept something from a strange animal you did not wish to frighten. The Drelkai came next. Somi had briefed everyone carefully about them. No eye contact, no sudden movements. Greet them with a small forward tilt of the head. Not a nod, a tilt. There was a difference. Hyunwoo had practiced this in the mirror that morning. He did it correctly. The lead Drelkai ambassador, a compact being in dark gray clothing, tilted its head back in return. It was a small thing, but Somi, watching from the side, let out a breath she had been holding. The Maravine arrived with the stiff, formal presence of people who considered ceremony very important and had a long list of ways it could go wrong. Their chief delegate scanned the room with cold, measuring eyes. Borum stepped forward and extended his hand. "Welcome home," he said, which was what he said to everyone who came aboard the station because he had always thought a station should feel like a place people could rest. He did not know that in Maravine culture, the phrase "welcome home" was reserved for the highest level of formal diplomatic reception, the kind that took months to plan and required the presence of at least 2 planetary officials. The Maravine chief delegate stared at Boram's extended hand. Then, very slowly, she reached out and shook it. She would think about that moment for a long time afterward. By the time all 5 delegations had boarded, the docking bay was full of beings who had one thing clearly in common. None of them had expected this. They had expected a shabby way station, yes, but shabby in a sad way, a neglected way, staffed by embarrassed humans who were doing their best to apologize for being there. Instead, they found a station that smelled like cooked food. Somewhere in the vents, there was music playing, quiet and steady. The floors were clean. The lights worked, and the humans standing in front of them were not apologetic at all. Overseer Rune pulled Do-hoon aside before the group had even moved past the entrance corridor. He looked at the wall, at the patched panel, at the handwritten sign that said, "Do not lean here." He looked at Do-hoon. "You are the science officer?" he asked. "Xenobiologist mostly," Do-hoon said. "Your station," Rune said carefully, "is not standard." "No," Do-hoon agreed. "The other species assigned to Kasara left within 2 years. Morale collapse, the records say. Do-hoon thought about this for a moment. "We made it nicer," he said. Rune had no reply to this. He went back to his delegation, and Do-hoon returned to his, which was really just Baram standing by the door, eating something out of a small container. Ariam had offered to give the Maravine head engineer a tour of the station's systems. This had started as a polite gesture, but became something else quickly. The engineer, whose name translated roughly as third-degree technical evaluator WAS, had 4 advanced degrees and had inspected 47 stations across the conclave. Within 5 minutes of the tour, she had stopped walking and was simply standing in front of the station's central atmospheric regulator, staring at it. The regulator was a patchwork of parts from at least 6 different systems, connected in ways that should not have worked, and very much did. "What is this?" Was asked. "Atmospheric regulator," Ariam said. "I can see that. What are these components?" "That piece is from a Vorath food printer. That tube is standard coolant line, just repurposed. That connector there is from a docking clamp we had to retire. And that bit at the top I made from parts of 2 other things that were not doing anything useful on their own." Was pulled out a small notebook. She began writing in it. Ariam watched her without comment. The way you watch someone do something you find slightly puzzling, but do not mind. Dinner happened in the crew room, which was not built for 15 people but managed. Somi had prepared something, working from memory on dishes that covered at least 3 different dietary requirements. The food was real, not printed, which the Sun delegation noticed immediately. One of them leaned over and said something quietly to another in their own language. Somi from across the table replied in the same language without looking up. The Sun both turned to look at her. She smiled and passed the bread. It was midway through the meal that the atmospheric regulator made a sound it had never made before. It was a low, grinding hum that slowly got worse. Everyone at the table heard it. The Drelkai ambassador went very still. Overseer Rune set down his fork. Boram looked at Ariam. Ariam was already standing up. She was gone for 11 minutes. Do-hoon kept the conversation moving. Somi told a story about a translation error at a conclave summit that had accidentally started a 3-day festival on a planet that had no idea why it was celebrating. Hyunwoo asked the Chivari delegate about their home system, which was the right question because the Chivari loved talking about their home system. The table stayed warm. When Ariam came back, she sat down and picked up her fork. "Fixed," she said. "What did you use?" Boram asked. "A spoon and some coolant line. I will do a proper repair in the morning." Was, the Maravine engineer, stared at her. "You fixed a failing atmospheric regulator in 11 minutes with a spoon." "It was a very good spoon," Ariam said, and meant it completely. There was a silence at the table, not an uncomfortable one, the kind of silence that happens when people are quietly revising something they thought they already understood. Overseer Rune picked his fork back up. The Drelkai ambassador, for the first time since boarding, let his shoulders drop slightly from their formal position. Outside the window, the stars moved slowly past, the way they always did, patient and indifferent. But inside the station, something had shifted, something small and hard to name, like the moment you realize the place you expected to be empty is actually full of something. The alarm was quiet, which made it worse. On most stations, a proximity alert was loud and clear and left no room for doubt about what was happening. Kasara's proximity alert was a soft beeping sound, gentle almost, like someone tapping on a door. Do-hoon heard it at 3 in the morning and lay still for a moment, thinking it was the recycling unit acting up again. Then his brain finished waking up, and he recognized the pattern, and he was out of his bunk before the 3rd beep. Boram was already at the control station when Do-hoon arrived. So was Somi, which was surprising. Somi was usually the last one up in the mornings. She was standing very close to the sensor display, her arms at her sides, very still. "What is it?" Do-hoon asked. Boram pointed at the screen. There was a shape on it that the system had marked with a yellow indicator, which meant it was something the sensors had found but could not identify. It was about 40,000 kilometers out, just sitting there, not moving, not transmitting on any known frequency. "It was not there 6 hours ago," Boram said. "It appeared on the passive sensors an hour after everyone went to sleep." Do-hoon leaned in and looked at the shape. It was long and narrow. The design was not Vithori. It was not Maravine or Chivari, or Drelkai or Soon. It was not anything he recognized from the Conclave vessel registry, which he had spent a professional amount of time studying because the registry made good reading on slow nights. "Is it a threat?" he asked. "Unknown," Borum said. "Is it doing anything?" "Nothing. It is just there." Do-hoon straightened up. "Then it is interesting," he said. By the time the delegations found out, which happened about 40 minutes later, because the Drelkai ambassador apparently never fully slept and had very good ears, the mood on the station had changed considerably. The Vithori wanted to leave immediately. The Maravine delegation held an emergency internal meeting and emerged from it looking grim. The Chavari were quiet in a way that felt different from their usual quiet. The Soon delegation produced a set of emergency protocols from somewhere and began reading from them out loud. Boram stood in the center of all of this and let each delegation say what they wanted to say. He did not interrupt. He did not rush them. When they were finished, he said, "We cannot leave. The FTL relay is offline. The nearest station with full capability is 3 days out on standard drive. Then we contact them," the Maravine chief delegate said. "We request an escort." "I have already sent the message," Borum said, "but I would like to know what we are dealing with before help arrives. Running from something we do not understand does not seem better to me than learning what it is." The Maravine chief delegate looked at him the way people look at someone who has just said something they find both reasonable and slightly alarming. It was Somi who first picked up the transmission. She had been at her station since the alarm, running the incoming frequencies through filters, and she found it buried in background noise at a band that modern conclave equipment barely bothered to check. It was old. Very old. She sat with it for a while, listening to it through her headset before she said anything. "It is a signal," she said when Do-hoon came to check on her. "A structured one, not random noise." "From the vessel?" "Yes, it is broadcasting continuously. I think it has been broadcasting for a long time. We only just got close enough to hear it." "What does it say?" She took off the headset and turned to face him. "I do not know yet, but the signal structure is something I have seen before. Not in anything modern, in old records, pre-conclave records." She paused. "Very pre-conclave." Yunwoo, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped in. "How old?" Somi looked at him. "Old enough that the conclave did not exist yet. Old enough that most of the species in the conclave did not exist as spacefaring civilizations yet." She turned back to her screen, "which means whatever is on that ship has been waiting out there for a very long time." Nobody said anything for a moment. Do-hoon turned to Ariam, who had appeared at some point without anyone noticing, as she often did. "Can we launch a probe?" he asked. "Not toward it. Just close enough to get better sensor readings." "Yes," she said. "How long?" 20 minutes to prep, another 15 for the probe to reach useful range." "Do it!" Overseer Rune was waiting for Do-hoon outside the science bay. He had been waiting quietly, which was something the Vithori did that humans often found unsettling because it was so still. "You are sending a probe," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," Do-hoon said. "The correct response to an unidentified contact is to maintain distance and wait for escort." "That is one response," Do-hoon agreed. "It is the recommended response." Do-hoon thought about how to explain what he was thinking. He was not sure there was a short way to do it. "If something has been sitting out there for thousands of years broadcasting a signal," he said, "and we are the first people in a very long time to get close enough to hear it, then I would like to know what it is saying, not because it is safe, because it seems important." Rune was quiet for a moment. "And if it is dangerous? Then we will deal with that when we know more." Do-hoon looked at him calmly. "Staying afraid of it does not make it less dangerous. It just means we stay afraid and ignorant." Rune had nothing to say to this either. He seemed to be building up a collection of things that Do-hoon had said that he had no answer for. The probe launched cleanly, which Ariam had been fairly confident about, and moved out toward the silent vessel while everyone on the station watched the feed. The vessel did not react to the probe. It did not move. It simply sat there, enormous and quiet and old, broadcasting its signal into the dark. And on the station, Somi sat with her headset on and her screens full of patterns that most people could not read, slowly, carefully, beginning to understand what it was trying to say. Somi worked through the night. She did not ask for help, but Hyunwoo stayed anyway, sitting quietly in the corner of her workspace with a cup of cold tea and his own datapad, cross-referencing old academic papers on pre-conclave signal theory. It was a narrow field. Most people considered it historical curiosity at best. Hyunwoo had written his thesis on it 3 years ago and been told by 2 separate professors that he should have chosen a more practical topic. He had not argued with them. He had simply kept studying it. Around 4 in the morning, he found something. "Somi," he said. She turned. He held up his pad. The signal pattern, the frequency intervals. I think I have seen this structure before. Not exactly this, but something close. There is a paper from about 40 years ago by a researcher who found similar patterns in deep space artifacts near the edge of what is now Soon territory. She thought they were geological interference at the time. She was probably wrong. Somi read the paper in 12 minutes. Then she turned back to her screens and started working faster. By morning, she had a partial translation. It was not complete. Parts of it were in a grammatical structure that did not match any known language family, but enough of it came through that she could see the shape of what it was. She brought it to Boraim, and Boraim called everyone in. They stood around the table in the crew room. All 5 humans and the 10 delegates from 5 species, crowded and close. Somi put the translation on the main screen. She explained what she had found in simple, clear sentences, the way she always spoke when something mattered. The vessel outside was not a warship. It was not a survey ship or a cargo carrier. It was a sentinel built by a civilization that had existed before the conclave, before most of the current member species had developed space travel, before the current shape of the galaxy's politics had formed. That civilization was gone now. It had been gone for a very long time, but before it disappeared, it had built this vessel and placed it at this location and given it one job: to wait for representatives of organized spacefaring civilizations to pass through this region and to deliver a message. The message was a territorial claim, a formal legal document in the language of a civilization that no longer existed, asserting rights over a region of space that no current conclave member had ever formally mapped or claimed. Under old interstellar law, which the conclave technically still recognized because nobody had ever gotten around to removing it from the books, an unacknowledged territorial claim could trigger a series of automated responses. The nature of those responses was not fully clear from the translation. What was clear was that the Sentinel had a countdown, and the countdown had started when it detected their presence, and they had about 18 hours. The room was very quiet when Somi finished. "This is not a matter for this station," the Meravine chief delegate said. "This requires conclave legal authority. Proper representation. This requires 3 days, Boraim said. "The escort is 3 days out. Then we wait." 18 hours, Boraim said again, quietly. Another silence. "Kasara sits outside the conclave's formal jurisdictional boundary," Boraim said. "Everyone in this room knows that. It is why nobody wanted to be stationed here. But it also means that this station and the people on it are technically operating in neutral space, which means we have standing that no current conclave member has right now. We are the only ones who can formally respond to this claim." The Meravine delegate opened her mouth. Boraim held up a hand, not rudely, just firmly. "I'm not asking for permission," he said. "I'm explaining what I am going to do. Because it is the right thing to do, and we have the time to do it correctly." Somi opened a channel to the Sentinel vessel. What happened next was not like a conversation in any normal sense. The consciousness on the other end identified itself only as the last recorder. It spoke slowly, with long pauses between thoughts, like something waking up after a very deep sleep. Somi answered every pause with patience. She did not rush it. She did not summarize. She listened to everything it said before she replied. The last recorder had been an archivist, not a soldier, not a diplomat. An archivist, someone whose entire purpose had been to collect and preserve the record of what its civilization had been. It had watched that civilization end. It had been alone since before any of the species currently standing in the crew room had invented the wheel. Somi did not say this out loud. She did not need to. It was in every slow, careful word the thing transmitted. Hyunwoo drafted the acknowledgement document. He worked fast, using the grammatical structure Somi had mapped, trying to use the right formal language, the right phrasing. Somi corrected 7 things without being asked. Do-hoon read it over twice and said it looked right to him. Arium found the official conclave stamp kit, discovered it had been lost sometime in the previous year, and used the station's docking authority seal instead. She stamped it with the same calm certainty she fixed broken things. They transmitted the document to the last recorder. There was a long pause, much longer than the others. Long enough that Hyunwoo checked twice to make sure the channel was still open. Then it responded. It had received the acknowledgement. The claim was formally noted. The countdown stopped. Before the channel closed, the last recorder sent one final transmission, directed specifically to Somi's frequency. She read it twice before she said anything to the others. When she finally looked up, her expression was something that was not quite sadness and not quite wonder, but was made of both. "It asked me a question," she said. "What did it ask?" Do-hoon said. Somi was quiet for a moment. "It asked if all humans are like this." She looked at her screen. "I asked it to explain what it meant. It said—" She stopped. She started again. "It said, unafraid." Nobody moved for a while. Outside the window, the Sentinel vessel sat in the dark. Its signal finally, after thousands of years. Quiet. 3 days later, the escort ship arrived. It was a conclave vessel, large and clean and very official-looking, with a crew that was visibly surprised to find all 5 delegations alive and in reasonably good health. The escort commander came aboard, looked around the station, and spent about 10 minutes trying to understand what he was looking at before giving up and asking Borum directly what had happened. Borum handed him a written report. The commander read it standing up in the docking bay, which he had not planned to do. By the 3rd page, he had found a wall to lean against. He finished the report and was quiet for a long time. "This is—" he started. "Accurate," Borum said. "A pre-conclave Sentinel vessel." "Yes." "And your linguist established contact and—" "Yes." "And an acknowledgement was filed using a docking authority seal." Borum looked at him steadily. "The conclave stamp was lost. We used what we had. The transmission was accepted." The escort commander looked at the report again. Then he looked at the station around him, at the patched walls and the repurposed pipes and the small handwritten sign that said, "Do not lean here." He put the report under his arm. "I will need to make some calls," he said. The calls, it turned out, reached quite a high level. Word of what had happened at Kasara moved through the conclave faster than the convoy had, by the time the escort ship was ready to depart with the 5 delegations. The station had received 6 formal messages from different conclave bodies requesting clarification, documentation, and in 2 cases, requesting the establishment of a permanent diplomatic presence at Kasara. Borum read each one, set them in a neat pile on the corner of his table, and went to fix the coffee machine, which had started making a sound it should not have been making. The delegations left one by one over the course of a morning. Each departure was different. The Soon delegation left efficiently and with precision, the way they did most things. Their lead delegate paused at the airlock long enough to tell Somi, in the Soon formal register, that she had done the station honor. It was the highest compliment the Soon gave. Somi thanked him in the same register. He looked briefly, genuinely startled, and then pleased. The Chavari left with warmth and a great deal of talking. They had liked the food. They had liked Yunwoo, who had spent several evenings asking them about their home system. One of them pressed a small carved object into his hand at the airlock. He did not know what it was, but he thanked them sincerely, and that seemed to be the right response. The Maravine departed with the formal stiffness that was simply how they were, but Was, the engineer, stopped on her way out and stood in front of Arium for a moment. She held out her notebook. Arium looked at it. "Keep it," Was said. "I want to know what you do next." Arium took the notebook and nodded once, which was how Arium expressed most things. Overseer Rune of the Vithori stopped at the airlock and turned to Do-hoon. He was quiet for a moment in that very still way of his. "I intend to petition the conclave for a status review of this station," he said. "A full upgrade, proper funding, proper equipment." Do-hoon thought about this. He thought about Arium's regulator, built from a food printer and a docking clamp. He thought about the sign on the wall that nobody had ever taken down. He thought about Hyunwoo's lists and Somi's late nights, and Borum's coffee mug and the way the station hummed when everything was working. "That is kind of you," he said, "but we are fine." Rune stared at him. The stare lasted long enough that it became something else, less confusion and more something close to understanding. "Yes," he finally said. "That is the problem." He stepped through the airlock and did not look back. The last to leave was the Drolkai ambassador. He had said almost nothing since arriving, which was normal for him, and had kept to himself during most of the events, which was also normal. Yunwoo had spent the first 2 days slightly terrified of him, which had softened gradually into a cautious respect. On the morning of departure, a small envelope appeared on the table in the crew room. It had Hyunwoo's name on it, written in the Drulkai formal script, which was a thing that required careful training to do correctly. Inside was a letter, 1 page, formal and precise. It said, "You asked the right questions." It said, "You listened when we answered." It said, in the closing line, which Somi translated for Hyunwoo, because the formal Drelkai farewell register was not something most people ever learned. "You are not what we expected. We mean this well." Hyunwoo read it 3 times. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his pocket. When everyone was gone, the station was quiet in the way it was always quiet. A lived-in, working quiet, full of small sounds from systems doing their jobs. Somi went back to her workspace, where the archive transmission from the last recorder was waiting for her. 11,000 years of records, language, art, science, history, the shape of a civilization that the galaxy had forgotten. It would take years to go through properly. She sat down, opened the first file, and felt the same thing she always felt at the start of a long piece of work. A deep and uncomplicated happiness. Borm wrote his official report. He was brief. He described the events in clear factual terms and noted the outcome and made a formal recommendation. The recommendation read, "Station should continue current operations. Staff performing within and beyond required parameters. No changes needed." He sent it, put the other 6 messages back in their neat pile, and finally fixed the coffee machine. Do-hoon was at his scope when Ariam brought him a cup of tea. She set it beside him without a word and went back to her own bench. He looked at it for a moment, then picked it up and took a sip and went back to the bio samples. Outside the observation window, the stars moved in their slow, indifferent way, the same as always. The Sentinel vessel was gone. It had gone dark after the final transmission, its long job finally done, and drifted quietly out of sensor range. Somewhere out there in the dark between stars, something old had finally found rest. The station hummed. The lights were steady. The coffee machine, freshly fixed, gurgled warmly in the back room. And on Waypoint Kisara, which the galaxy had called the worst seat in the galaxy, 5 humans went back to work.